Hello, sunshine. I'm ALEXI LALAS, and welcome to the State of the Union podcast, where we look at the beautiful game on and off the field through the lens of red, white, and blue-colored glasses. This week, we'll be obviously talking about, yes, the return of the Bundesliga. We'll also be talking about wind of change, Alphonso Davies, Haaland, what club you may or may not buy if you had a bunch of money, the 92 Dream Team, some MLS possibilities, question mark, and so much more. But first, joining me, as always, my friend, my colleague, my guiding light, David Massey, a soccer savant and a Fox Soccer researcher and writer extraordinaire. How are you on this, what is this, Sunday morning, I think it is, Massey. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing well, and I know we're going to be talking about German soccer, but first, I would like to discuss with you a German rock band.
Yes. So you got to me this week.
Yes.
We are both avid listeners and voracious consumers of the podcast genre out there. All different genres within it, but we listen to a lot of podcasts. Obviously, we do podcasts, and hopefully people that are listening and watching out there are also partaking in the incredible podcast industry that is out there. And so you got to me midweek and asked me a question that got me incredibly intrigued. So what did you ask me?
Well, I asked if you had listened to Wind of Change. This past week, a podcast documentary was released on Spotify called Wind of Change. Broadly speaking, it's about the propaganda role that rock music played during the Cold War. More specifically, it's hosted by this journalist who investigated the urban legend that the CIA actually wrote the song Wind of Change by the German rock band Scorpions. The official story is that Scorpions took part in a famous concert in Moscow in August of 1989 alongside the likes of Bon Jovi and Motley Crue. This was right before the fall of communism, and the lead singer of Scorpions could sense what was happening and was inspired to write a ballad about freedom. It was released in 1990. It was a mega hit around the world. It's considered this iconic anthem about the end of the Cold War, but there is this urban legend that the CIA actually wrote it, and so this journalist tried to get to the bottom of that. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I highly recommend it. It's 8 episodes, each about 40 minutes long, but in texting with you this past week, I got the sense that you maybe weren't such a big fan.
No, first off, it warmed the cockles of my redheaded heart, just the fact that you were talking about Scorpions. And by the way, the fact that you called it Scorpions as opposed to the Scorpions in rock circles, that will already endear you. So I love the fact that you were doing that, number one. Number two, the story that it told, it was interesting. And by the way, I listened to the entire thing. Do I believe it? No, but it is plausible, and it's the perfect example of the conspiracy theorists out there that can take something with a possibility, a kernel of possibility, and turn it into a form of entertainment in this case in the form of a podcast. Because as you listen to it, even if you don't know anything about the genre of music or Scorpions or even that song, you are pulled in, which is what makes it interesting. And the intrigue that you're talking about is fascinating because you start to think and you start to change your mind at different points throughout it all. A couple of things. The Moscow Music Peace Festival was a huge part of my childhood or growing up. So I watched it live. It was right up my alley with the bands that were involved, whether it was, like you mentioned, Scorpions, Skid Row, Cinderella, Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, these types of bands that were playing that went over to do this show were right up my alley. So I was going to listen to it. Scorpions are a band that I have followed for years. Scorpions are a band that I have seen play live. Klaus Meine has one of the great voices in rock in his ability to control it and the longevity of not just the band, but of his voice, which has held up over the years. So you were speaking my language, Massey, when you reached out to me. I was not going to be elitist or anything in terms of the fact that you were being brought into this metal type of tent. So I love the fact. Do I believe it? Not really. However, this is what gets you interested in that Klaus Meine, the lead singer, had not been the writer for the band. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, not just that he writes a song, but that he writes one, if not the most popular song that they ever had, and certainly the one that transcended the normal fan base that were out there. And it was such a departure and different type of song. I'm not saying it can't happen, but it was very, very interesting. And I'm not going to give it all away. You have to actually listen to it. And like you said, it's not just about the song. It's about the way that propaganda is used and the way that the United States and the CIA has used propaganda over the years, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. And we're not telling you anything you don't know. That's something that happens. And the arts and culture are obviously a huge part of what can make an impact. And that whole Cold Era and Cold War type of situation and the wall and what Russia was and what it is, it just plays into it. So you're absolutely right. It's fascinating. You should check it out. It's a wonderful story. Ultimately, I don't believe it, but I'm not saying that there weren't times where I caught myself going, maybe not, but ultimately I said I didn't believe it. So thank you for listening to that. I'm going to send you some Scorpions songs. You will know that if you watched indoor soccer when we were talking to Jurgen Klopp, obviously a German and a metal fan, the song that I actually played was Scorpions, "Rock You Like a Hurricane," one of their major hits before Wind of Change came about. So it made me so happy that you were talking about this, and I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. But this is a soccer podcast. It's a soccer and life and everything in between podcast. But for the most part, it's soccer. And Massey, I am ready to talk about soccer. Shall we light this candle?
Yep.
All right, folks. Yep, we saw it. And it was glorious. Soccer returned this weekend in the form of the Bundesliga. It provided, shall we say, some hope, some joy, some excitement for both those of us that were desperate and I guess just in general curious sports fans all over the world. Now, it wasn't perfect, but certainly given the challenging times, I don't think it had to be. But I think that we can all agree, because this is often the response that I'm seeing, is that it was, quote, better than nothing. Absolutely, it was better than nothing. Hell, a shooting drill would be better than nothing. A 5v2 would be better than nothing. But just because something is quote, better than nothing, doesn't mean that it was good, or it doesn't mean that it can't be better. So we talked about this on the pod last week, Massey, and it was predictable. The empty stadiums that these games were played in front of were stark. They were eerie. They were jarring. They were devoid of any resemblance of that traditional type of energy that we associate with the game that we love. There were beautiful goals. There was controversy and VAR, and there was plenty of drama, but it was all happening without that soundtrack. And it was this alternate version of the sport that, let's be honest, it was always destined to suffer because it was this alternate version. It was like, we talked about Scorpions, right? Okay, so this was like a hard rock band playing an acoustic show, all right? Yes, it can be interesting, it can be creative, and it can even be memorable, but ultimately it's missing the power and therefore the essence of what that band has come to define their experience. This was soccer unplugged, but this is also a work in progress, right? This is, as we've said time and time again, this is a test case, and there's going to be tweaks. For example, in watching it, I talked about that lack of the soundtrack. So I would look at it, and if I was watching it either internally or externally, I would like to see the broadcast pipe in crowd noise, somebody working a fader, somebody creative and somebody that understands the up and downs of the game. I think if it's done correctly, I think it could really enhance the viewing experience, because the ear wants what the ear wants. But regardless, Massey, it is great to have the game back, even in its less than ideal form. It's unplugged soccer, but I'll take it. Massey, thoughts?
It had a preseason feel to me, right down to the extra substitutions, which are a hallmark of preseason games. That sensation you feel when you watch your team's first preseason game, where you haven't watched them in a couple of months, you miss soccer, and it's sort of back, but it's not all the way back, but at least it's something. Now, the only thing I would say about that is these aren't preseason games. These games count, and we're in the stretch run of a league which has a title race, top four race, relegation battle going on. So a lot of people did remark that the empty stadiums makes the games feel less consequential than they are. Do you buy that? And does that bother you that these felt more like exhibition games? Is that only temporary as we get used to this? Are they going to feel like normal games?
It doesn't bother me in that, like I said, it was predictable and expected. This is, and keep in mind that a closed door type of scenario or a game without fans, it's not as if it's never happened. Okay, it has happened, and the reason why it has happened has often been punitive. Okay, it has been to punish a club for a situation either on or off the field, something that it has done. So it's not advantageous to anyone, but that it was a preseason type of feel. I don't think it had anything to do with the fact that the teams were off for 2 months. If you're looking at it saying, they're rusty or there was a bad pass here, I think it's only exasperated by the situation. I'm telling you right now, while they may have been rusty, if there were crowds there and if it was a normal type of setting, you wouldn't miss a beat. You wouldn't have cared, let alone even recognize the fact that people were rusty. This is all relative to what is happening around the field. And that is not going to change anytime soon. So this is the new normal. Are we going to adjust to it? Yes, we're going to have to. And like I said, is this better than having nothing? Absolutely. But I do think that there are some tweaks. I do think that there are some things that people are going to do. And all the things that we're screaming and yelling about on Twitter and all of these ideas, don't think for a second that whether it's the Bundesliga or any other league that is in the midst of planning to try to come back isn't going through all of these different things. Some of it we'll see in real time. It will change from week to week. Even the Bundesliga is going to change from week to week. Some of it is just not going to be feasible. All right. From a practical perspective, either financially it's not going to work, or the technology doesn't exist, or just the resources don't make sense. But they are going to tweak this as we go through, and everybody is watching. And I don't know if you saw, Massey, but that 51-page document that the Bundesliga put out, it was so German, beautifully German in the way that it was. I mean, down to every single player, what they wanted you to do. So they're already, the protocol is there, but they're going to tweak it. And this weekend will give them an incredible amount of data of what went well and what didn't go well. On a whole, I think it went incredibly successful. I think it was an incredible success. I don't know if we use a success, but let's just call it a success for doing something that has never been done. It doesn't mean, like I said, it can't improve. Mosse.
Yeah, some of the rules were just for show. You have players standing farther apart during the coin toss, but during a corner, they're all bunched together. Players are going to collide when they're going for the ball. So anything that's an attempt to social distance the players on the field that are taking part in the game, to me, feels like a stretch. But for the most part, most of the things they did make sense, and it seems like they were well executed. I had no issue with the 5 subs. As we talked about, it's still only 3 stoppages of play, so it didn't disrupt the flow of the game. A lot of teams didn't even make the 5 subs, so it's not like they're going to make them just to make them, but it's a good option to have considering players aren't in ideal shape and you have more players picking up niggling injuries. So I like the 5 subs, had no issue with that.
It didn't, I mean, at least on the surface, it didn't change the game. The way that it was played, we talked about what you were going to be able to hear. You're going to be able to hear the players. And yes, we heard the players at times screaming. You were going to be able to hear the crunching, if you will, of players coming together. You were going to be able to hear the actual ball hit, the communication with the coach, all of that different stuff. You heard it, obviously, with the incredible mix of cultures and backgrounds. There was a lot of different languages flying around. But as I had said before, that novelty will wear thin very, very, very quickly. So that was, that was fine. It was interesting also, the different broadcasts in the way that, not all empty stadium broadcasts are created equally in terms of the audio, and some were better than others for whatever reason. I don't know. I'm not, I don't understand it enough to know why, but I'm switching back and forth between games. There were ones that I guess they're all jarring, but there were ones that were less jarring and more, I guess, a more soft than harsh type of approach to the audio. but it was all different, obviously.
In the Augsburg game, Augsburg, by the way, didn't have their manager Heiko Herrlich because teams were supposed to be under strict quarantine for the last week, and he violated it by walking to the store to buy toothpaste, and so he was prohibited from managing in this game. But in the Augsburg-Wolfsburg match, there was a banner that the fans somehow got into the stadium that read something like, "Your business makes me sick." And I was reading that public opinion in Germany is actually against these games being played. As we know, the culture in Germany is very much that the fans feel a sense of ownership about the league. They've made that very clear in their protests about Monday games, about the 50+1 stuff, even about Germany bidding for Euro 2024. So the idea that these games are being played without fans merely so clubs can collect the television money. You know, the fans are very much against the commercialization of the sport. So that offends their sensibilities. What's your reaction to that?
Fans are going to complain and whine. That's what fans do, and nobody does it better than the Germans. That sense of, well, some would call it ownership, some would call it entitlement, is always there, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It is a part of the checks and balances in a good way. You know, I do think that the Bundesliga, and keep in mind, I think we've said this before. We have to be careful because the country and culture of Germany is very, very different than a lot of others. And there's a reason why they have been able to be first. And I do think that they deserve credit for doing this to the best of their abilities. And I think doing as much as they possibly can to make it as safe and as welcoming as they can to the players. When it comes to the actual fans, is there a business component behind this? Absolutely, there's a business component behind this, but there's a business component behind a lot of stuff right now, and there will be actions that are relative to business out there. And I know this is very different than comparing it to a mom and pop type of business that's suffering right now. But there are business realities, and there are business reactions that are going to have to be addressed going forward. So I do think that the fans, maybe more so than other places, are going to have a say in Germany. But as we've seen, ultimately, you can have your say, and then Bundesliga is going to do what the Bundesliga is going to do. That they're doing it in what I believe is, I guess, the safest way possible in admittedly very interesting and unknowing times. I think that's a credit to the Bundesliga. And I think that they will come out of this being looked at as innovators and being looked at as leaders going forward. But there's a lot of other leagues that are going to, as we said, just pick and choose some different things out there and tweak some stuff going forward. You know, the actual play on the field, Massey, was it as cathartic, or was it as impactful as you thought it was going to be when that whistle blew and the actual games and the playing started?
It was, yeah. I very much enjoyed the Dortmund-Schalke match. Dortmund were in top form. I don't know if you want to transition to actually talking about specific teams and performances.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Well, look, for those of us that want somebody other than Bayern to win the league, we thought we had two cracks at it, but I think Leipzig are off the case. They were already fading before play was suspended, and then they come back here with a 1-1 draw against Freiburg. Could have been worse. Freiburg actually had a stoppage time winner disallowed by VAR. Which, of course, had fans screaming about VAR, which is how you know things are somewhat back to normal.
That's normal, right?
But, so Leipzig are now 7 points back of Bayern, who won today. They took care of Union Berlin, as Kate Abdo says. But, yeah, I mean, Dortmund certainly had the best performance of the weekend. You know, it's the sort of performance that actually makes you sad that Dortmund can't sort of cross the T's and dot the I's, because they have so much talent. On the good days, they're such a joy to watch. There's so much attacking depth there. The fact that Marco Reus is out, Jadon Sancho is essentially out, and yet you still have Julian Brandt with a brilliant performance, Thorgan Hazard playing well, Erling Haaland doing Erling Haaland things, not only the goal, but also lovely pass to Guerrero for the fourth goal. And so Dortmund was in absolute top form. Also, no Witzel or Emre Can in the middle of the field, and yet still they hammered Schalke. So, you know, it's sort of that tantalizing glimpse at Dortmund's potential, which makes it all the more frustrating, the fact that they can't put it all together. But nevertheless, I was very impressed with them.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this game featuring Dortmund and Schalke, right, was a derby, right?
Correct.
And Schalke came out and you know what, the bed, okay, in a derby type of situation. Now, it should be noted that of the so far, and we're recording this on a Sunday, there's another game on Monday, but so far of the 8 games that have been played, there was only one home team that actually won, which is ultimately Dortmund. So that home field advantage has kind of, I guess, I mean, it's still a small sample size, but it certainly isn't as prevalent as it would be in normal times, and that's indicative of the results that we have. I was impressed after the game because our friend, an American, Weston McKinney, who had just gotten his ass kicked 4-0 in that derby, actually was very, very honest in the assessment, saying, you know what, it's the same for everybody. And obviously we weren't prepared. And I think it is fair to hold teams accountable and players accountable that came out and obviously were not prepared. Now, it doesn't mean that Schalke couldn't have lost this in normal times in the same way. You mentioned all the incredible players and the obvious talent that Borussia Dortmund has. But I think that as we see these results play out, the individuals and the teams that aren't able to bring it, okay, in these types of situation, yes, I think it's fair to say what happened. What were you doing over the last couple of months, either individually or collectively, to have yourself ready physically and ready mentally for that kickoff? We all know it's not ideal, but to Weston McKinney's credit, he didn't shirk the responsibility. And he didn't say, yes, but you know, the crowd wasn't there and it threw us off. But no, he said, it's the same for everybody. And obviously we weren't there. Do you think that that's fair, Massey, in terms of the assessment, or was this just a much better team beating up on a much weaker team?
No, I mean, I think it's tough that first game out of the gate. Some clubs are going to handle it better than others. And perhaps maybe you got to give each team one game to sort of get used to this. But no, I mean, I asked you this kind of off the air last week. How much are we going to be able to analyze these games like we normally would? Or how much is there going to be this sort of crutch of like, well, these are unusual circumstances, so you can't say anything too good or bad about any team. And it's going to be interesting to see how the media handles that. I mean, if Schalke perform poorly the rest of the way here and lose every game, how does that affect your perception of David Wagner's job this season? Or are you going to say, no, wait a minute, under normal circumstances, he was doing well, but then you can't read anything into these final 9 games. It's going to be kind of interesting to see how the media deals with that.
Yeah, I mean, if that happens, it's not because of the lockdown and the pandemic. If the Red Bulls go off the boil, or RB Leipzig goes off the boil here, okay, and the team that we actually thought was going to give a Bayern Munich a run for their money at the end is now just fighting for top 4, that's a problem. And that has nothing to do with the pandemic, all right? If you come back a shadow of yourself after the pandemic, it's on you. It's what you have or haven't done, more likely what you haven't done. And you haven't prepared yourself. And once again, it's all relative. Everybody's going through the same things. And there are those that were better equipped, either through personnel or just the way that personnel functioned. They had better people. They had a better plan, and they executed the plan better. That kudos to them. They should get props. We should prop them up for what they did in the same way that, you know, players that play well, they did that work. And maybe it's with the help, and oftentimes it is with the help of a lot of people out there. But yeah, I think that's completely fair. The other thing, Massey, in the difference, I guess the optics and the aesthetic that we were watching there is, you know, one of the moments and one of the great parts of our game is that goals are so frequent, but when they are scored, it is this incredible release. On the field, off the field, because they're so rare, it makes it that much more important. And we saw, as you mentioned, there's protocol put in place, and sometimes it's hard with everything coursing through your veins, but it was, you know, a socially distanced type of celebration. And one of the essences of soccer is that celebration, taking off your shirt, hugging, kissing, running around, that become iconic. And that was completely taken out and changed a little bit. But I think you talk about jarring. First off, the actual action of the goal. All right. So whether it was a cross coming in, the ball going in the back of the net, actually hearing the ball going in the back of the net, not hearing that instantaneous reaction, not seeing the emotion that is often, you know, played out through the physical actions of a player, the celebration, whether it's spontaneous or whether it's a rehearsed type of celebration, not having that. I mean, that to me was very, very strange. And as we're going through this, the players are going to have to adjust and they're going to learn. And it was almost as if in real time, they were trying to figure out what their new normal is for the celebration of a goal even.
Yeah, Hertha Berlin was the one team that really celebrated their goals against Hoffenheim. They had a nice 3-0 win. And as you mentioned, there was even a kiss in there after one of the goals. And I was happy to read this morning that it sounds like they're not going to be punished for that. The German Federation is going to exercise some common sense here and realize that this is something new that everybody's getting used to. And so they're not going to punish them yet. But yeah, Hertha Berlin, I mentioned them last week when we were talking about potential teams to adopt. They got a little something going on right now. They have this new investor, Lars Windhorst, that's poured a lot of money into the club. They were able to make some nice January signings. One of them being this Brazilian striker, Matheus Cunha, who scored a lovely goal against Hoffenheim. I know Tim Vickery thinks Matheus Cunha is kind of a sleeper in the Brazilian center forward picture over the next couple of years. So Hertha Berlin, very impressive. Gladbach also had a nice win away to Frankfurt, 3-1. Playa and Marcus Thuram among the goal scorers there. They're actually up to third place ahead of Leipzig, but I can't really see them winning the title. So I think it really is between Bayern and Dortmund now. So, and yeah, it was interesting seeing the different celebrations from team to team. Some players sort of remembered to be a little bit more reserved, and others, they just couldn't help themselves. It's so instinctive, you know.
Mosse, question for you.
Yep.
Is Erling Haaland the best striker in the world right now?
It's a tough one. You know, we're going to talk about Alphonso Davies in a minute, and there's sort of this question looming over him, whether he's already the best left back in the world. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that you need to do it for a bit of a sustained period. I don't think either Haaland or Davies need to necessarily improve at all from where they are now, but that you perhaps could argue that they need to maintain this level for a bit longer before we can sort of, you know, anoint them as the best in the world at their positions. But no, I mean, Haaland is absolutely incredible. I mean, this is 10 and 9 Bundesliga games since he arrived. Obviously had incredible numbers at Salzburg under Jesse Marsch. We've talked on the pod about how intelligently he's managed his career. He's being linked with Real Madrid now by the Madrid media. I hope he's not foolish enough to make that move anytime soon. He'll end up at a club like that, but he'll go when he's ready. He should stay at Dortmund for a little bit longer. And yeah, no, I have nothing but good things to say about him. I guess the one knock on him would be his post-match interviews, but as a player, I have nothing negative to say about him.
Hey, see, and this is where we may disagree. I would argue that is actually part of being a player. And so, yes, his post-game interview was horrible. All right. In the annals of post-game interviews, it was horrible. And but as a player on the field, oh my God. I mean, he's on the fast track to not just stardom, but I don't think that it's beyond the pale to say right at this moment that he is the best striker in the world. Now there's other people out there that would disagree. And like you said, from a consistency standpoint, it's still a very small size here, but he didn't miss a beat, came right back. And you know, that he can't do an interview isn't going to hurt him. But I will say this, when I was, I made a point of saying that it was a bad interview and it was a wasted opportunity. And a lot of people said, it's second language and he's only 19 years old. Well, here's the deal. If you're 19 years old, all right, this is a player who from an early age has been coddled and fostered to be this player to great effect, because now we're talking about him as one of the great goal scorers and he's 19 years old. So he has been, they have given him the skills to be potentially the greatest goal scorer at this moment at 19 years old. So why wouldn't you also give him the skills to be able to function in a post-game interview setting? I look at that as a part of his job that's going to be there. And I say that with the understanding that I'm tipping my hat a little bit here, Massey. I have started the Jordan documentary, okay? And it occurred to me while watching it. I've only watched the first couple because now I can watch it from start to finish, but I've only watched the first couple. But obviously it focuses a lot on him as a young player. And when the microphone was put in front of him, you don't have to be Robin Williams. That's what I'm saying, okay? But you have to recognize what is happening here and the opportunity that you have. And yes, I would argue the responsibility that you have. So not to make too much about it, because ultimately he doesn't care. And most people aren't going to care as long as he keeps putting the ball in the back of the net. But the argument that he's young, I don't think that flies, because if you're able to make him one of the great goal scorers in the world by the age of 19, then I think that you could also make him at least acceptable. Like I said, it doesn't have to be Robin Williams. It doesn't even have to be an over-the-top type of personality, but at least acceptable in terms of what he says when a microphone is put in front of him. And I know it's not his first language, but you can figure it out. So anyway, because it was off of the moment, and this was a cool moment where we know the yellow wall there at Dortmund is such a huge part of the entire culture and the phenomenon that is Dortmund. And after the game, there's always the recognition of the players, of the fans. And yet they still went to the wall, the non-existent wall, because there are no fans, and did that in, I guess, respect of what would have been there in normal times. It was a cool little thing to see happen at the end of the game.
Well, you mentioned Holland is only 19. Dortmund also have a very talented 17-year-old named Giovanni Reyna, who was slated to start this match and then apparently got injured during warm-ups, was not able to play. And I have to say, that kind of set the tone for what was a disappointing weekend on the American front. What did you make of it?
Yeah, it was disappointing. I think a lot of people were excited to see him. And I think in this particular game, where they were kind of given the run of the place, that he would have shown. I think he would. This would have been a great game for him to play. Now, in the same way that I talk about Christian Pulisic, where staying healthy is a skill, I hope that this is just an aberration. I hope this is just an anomaly. And it sucks that it comes in warm up of the actual game that you are scheduled to start. They haven't been clear, but we're hoping that it's not anything serious, and nothing has come up since the game to say that it is serious. But it sucks. It sucks for him, and it sucks for us, because we wanted to see him. And so not getting to see Gio Reyna, and then watching Weston McKennie and Schalke just get completely destroyed. Although I think and maybe I'm always going to be a little biased, but I do think that he was one of the bright spots of that team, and his work ethic is never in question, but I think he's trying to do so much, and at times he can do a tremendous amount. But the fact is, from a Weston McKennie standpoint, he needs to get to a better team, and he might, and he might, but he needs to parlay this. And I think that he is actually a much better player than we even know right now, but he's being forced to play in a situation where it's difficult for him to do the things. And even saying that, he's still at times one of the highlights of the team.
And then Tyler Adams had kind of a so-so game for Leipzig in their draw against Freiburg. John Brooks scored an own goal for Wolfsburg against Augsburg. So disappointing overall. I will say, we're taping this on a Sunday. The final match of the round on Monday pits Bremen against Leverkusen. And I think, other than Gio Reyna's continued development, the most interesting American story for me down the stretch here is Josh Sargent. Bremen are having a disastrous season. They're in the relegation zone, and whether he can help them get out of that. And if not, if they do get relegated, has he shown enough to be able to stay in the Bundesliga with another team, or would he have to drop down a division? So Sargent is a guy that I think is going to be interesting to watch here in the coming months.
Yeah, you mentioned Tyler Adams playing in that much more right backish type of position. We have seen him play with Greg Berhalter, the national team. I don't know if that's something that continues on. I like him much more in a much more central role, but he wasn't non-existent, but he didn't have a major impact on the game in that you said, hey, look, there's Tyler Adams doing what Tyler Adams does, because in that position, he doesn't necessarily do the things that Tyler Adams does. You mentioned John Brooks. As far as Josh Sargent, I don't know, Mosse, if he's done enough to garner the attention of others. And once again, people will have to look at it and say, and take the team that he's playing with out of the equation, or factor in a whole lot more and say it's unfair for a goal scorer in that situation to be judged because of the lack of quality that is around him. And I guess you could say that about anybody on a bad team, but you have to be able to take that person out and juxtapose it and put him in a different situation and be confident that he's going to be much better being given plenty of service and put the ball in the back of the net. But I don't know. Is this a Bobby Wood-esque type of situation? I fear that that's what it is. I think he's better than Bobby Wood, but I'm not sure there are going to be a lot of suitors out there if and when they go down that want to grab him up as, hey, this is a diamond in the rough. I don't know. Do you think?
I was going to make the Bobby Wood comparison. I think that's very apt, but I do agree with you. Sargent is more talented than Bobby Wood. There's more upside there. So I actually could see another Bundesliga club grabbing him. So yeah, we'll see. It depends, I think, a lot on how he plays here down the stretch.
All right. Well, let's wrap this up, Mosse, when it comes to the Bundesliga and put a bow on it. A scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest thing you've ever seen, 1 being the worst thing that you've ever seen. Where does this come on that spectrum? I know there's a lot of expectation out there, and I know, as I said, there's a lot of desperation just for anything and a lot of curiosity for this being, I know it's not the first, but let's be honest, from an elite standpoint and a league that resonates around the world, it is the first. So where do you give it from a 1 to 10?
I'd say from a quality of football standpoint, I give it like a solid 8. I was actually generally impressed with the level considering the layoff. As far as all the rules and stuff, we'll have to wait and see how this week plays out, how many players test positive. I don't want to render a judgment on that yet because it could look bad in a day or two if news breaks out that all these players are testing positive.
I wouldn't give it an 8. I would still give it certainly a passing and I'd probably give it a 7. But I don't think that I was affected and impacted to the extent that you were, or the way that I thought I was going to be. I thought it was going to hit me harder in a good way. I thought it was going to satisfy something that was missing in a more complete way than it did. So, but I'm heartless and soulless.
What did you enjoy more, watching the Dortmund Schalke game or listening to the Wind of Change podcast?
No, I'd still watch Dortmund Schalke as much as I love Scorpions. It's good. All right, Mosse. Well, like I said, it's a work in progress. So this time next week, we'll be sitting here with a whole nother swath of games having happened and those adjustments and those tweaks having happened over the week. So we'll see. Onward and upward with the Bundesliga, and who knows who's next to come online. All right, so coming up, we got Ask Alexi. You know what? You love it. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of things, including the great Alphonso Davies. We'll be talking about if you had money buying a team. We'll also be taking a look at the potential of an MLS, I don't know if we call it a season, but let's just say the return of MLS. All of that in Ask Alexi coming up. All right, it's that time again. Time for Ask Alexi. Use that hashtag Ask Alexi and you ask us questions. You can also use Ask Mosse. It doesn't matter, but send us along those questions. Use that hashtag on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all the different platforms out there. And each week we pick a few and we read them out as we are about to do right now. Mosse, what do the people want to know this week?
First up, at A. Robinson 1987, would you say Alphonso Davies is the best player in CONCACAF?
Interesting.
Can I tweak this question a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't want to go down the Carlos Vela rabbit hole and argue about MLS versus Europe and compare a young player to an older player. I think the better way to look at it is he the best young player in CONCACAF? Because we've talked so much about all the U.S. young talent, Pulisic, McKinney, Adams, Gio Reyna, Serginho Dest. Could you make a case that Davies is better than all of them? That if you were ranking the best young players in the world, you would put Alphonso Davies before you would put any American?
I mean, Christian Pulisic. Yeah, I'd still put Alphonso Davies ahead of Christian Pulisic. I'd put him ahead of, I don't know, Chucky Lozano, those types of young CONCACAF players. So yes, to answer your question, yeah, I would say that he is the best player in CONCACAF. That doesn't mean that he's going to dominate CONCACAF or dominate with Canada. And we also know that, I mean, it's weird because he's the best player in CONCACAF, but that's because he's playing left back for Bayern Munich. And in my estimation, you can argue he's the best left back in the world. And yet he doesn't play that position when he comes to Canada, which is where you're actually going to see him in CONCACAF. So it is a strange, it's not as simple as it seems. But I will say, yes, I think it is. I mean, the fact that we are talking about a CONCACAF player, and he is a CONCACAF player, even in a different position, but he is a CONCACAF player, as one of the best in the world at his position, that in and of itself is great. And I know form is fallacy and it doesn't always translate, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt right now for what he has become. Let's say even over the last 6 months, that's how rapidly his value has increased, and his name recognition has increased. But you can't do it alone. And when he gets with Canada, where he's playing and the team that he is playing for are a very, very different proposition than when he steps on the field each and every time for Bayern Munich.
Although Matt Doyle wrote a piece recently about Canada's young talent. He's very high on them. They do have this striker, Jonathan David, who's playing with Ghent right now, but who's being linked with Bayern Munich and all these big European giants. And so Canada does have a little something going on there. So it'll be interesting to see how they fare in the next few years.
Well, what will be interesting to see is when this new form of qualifying comes out, because this hex, I don't think, is going to happen in the traditional way. It might work to Canada's advantage because the way things were going, were probably not going to be included in the hex. And so they were going to have to go the long way around and play all those play-in games. And so this might work out for them. And if they are as good as Matt Doyle or you or anybody else thinks, they might have an easier path to actually get to the World Cup. And that would be great. I want to see, as I've said before, I want to see Canada in the World Cup. I vividly remember watching Canada in the 1986 World Cup, and they were my own because of the proximity growing up in Michigan and Canada. It meant so much to us. So I don't want to wait till 2026 to see the men's team play, or the men's Canadian team play in a World Cup. And if it's going to happen, absolutely it's going to happen because of the contributions of Alphonso Davies, not necessarily at left back, as I said, but with that team going forward. So good question. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that may disagree and have other players in CONCACAF, but I'm hard pressed to find one right now that is a legitimate competitor other than, possibly Christian Pulisic.
Next up, at Philonic, your recent conversation has me wondering if Alexi Lalas or Statman Massey had $300 million to spend on a club, do you buy established Newcastle or brand new MLS expansion team?
Interesting. I think I buy an MLS expansion team. Now, keep in mind, the $300 million is just to buy the team. And nowadays, you're actually going to need, probably end up doubling that for a new stadium situation and a new training facility when it comes to an MLS team. But you're also mitigating the risk of relegation that we all know, and the incredible appreciation of these teams that has happened over the last 10 years. If you extrapolate that out, that investment, whatever it ends up being, another 10 years from now, another 20 years from now, notwithstanding the craziness that we're going through right now, I think it will end up being a better investment, I think, than Newcastle. I don't know a tremendous amount about Newcastle other than the incredible popularity and that it is an established brand, not an international brand. People know what Newcastle is. The 60,000 that they get every single game, regardless of what league they are in. So there is a value to that. And if you were to bring that Newcastle team to a elite level, you'd have to do that through spending. How much more would that team be worth when you flipped it? That's the way I'm looking at it, is as an investment. And I still think from a long-term investment, and it's got to be a long-term investment, I would probably rather go with an MLS team. What about you, Massey?
Yeah, well, I recognize that MLS has more runway to grow in the coming years and decades. The Premier League isn't going to become any more popular than it already is now. And also what you mentioned about no relegation is nice. You don't have that risk. But I think if I was an owner that was going to spend a lot of money on players, I think in the short term, I'd still prefer Newcastle. It's more prestigious to own a Premier League club than an MLS club. And there are less restrictions in the Premier League. You can
That's true.
essentially buy your way to being like a mega super relevant successful club, while in MLS, because there's this engineered parity, you have to deal with salary caps and all sorts of rules. So I think I would go with Newcastle. He says your recent conversation, what he's alluding to there is that we discussed recently in the pod the fact that Newcastle might be sold to a Saudi Arabian group. One note on that story, there's a different Saudi Arabian group that's now looking to buy Marseille. And that would be really interesting because Qatar and Saudi Arabia right now have this geopolitical battle for global prestige. I know we don't want to get into politics too much here, but as we know, Qatar, they bought into PSG. So if some Saudi group were to buy Marseille, and by the way, they'd be buying it from an American, Frank McCourt, who's the former owner of the Dodgers, that would set up this real fascinating head-to-head battle because PSG and Marseille are like bitter rivals, and you'd have a Qatari-owned club and a Saudi-owned club competing in the same league head-to-head. So keep an eye on that.
I mean, as much as I love to talk about the business and I make practical decisions based on the business, for many of these folks, I mean, these are status symbols. These are luxury items. These are toys for people. And it's an amazing toy to be able to, to be able to buy. But that's the way that I was coming at this question. And, I don't think that the kicking the tires is going to stop. And I don't think that the international investment is going to stop. And I don't think that from an internal perspective, any league, whether it's the EPL or whether it's MLS, is going to say no to external investment and foreign investors that want to come in and have it, either because they think it's a smart business decision, and oftentimes that is a major part of it, or if they just feel that this is where they want to spend their money and this is the toy that they want to have. If they want to spend it, rather spend it with whoever that league is than others. Good question. What else, Mosse? Anything else?
Well, and on this staying with the MLS theme, at Manny Juarez wants to know thoughts on the Orlando plan for MLS.
Okay, so a lot of talk this last week about the potential of a return of Major League Soccer, not in the form that we're seeing over with the Bundesliga in a finishing out of the season in the cities and at the stadiums that teams normally play, but as a potential of going to a neutral site. At times they talked about multiple sites, but it looks like with the reporting of Stephen Goff and others that this site is singular in Orlando and that all the teams would come down. Now, on the surface, this looks interesting. I think it looks entertaining. It also looks like it's not going to be in any way, shape, or form a league the likes of which we have ever seen, or the traditional version of Major League Soccer. It is going to be a standalone type of event with multiple games, obviously not in front of anybody, but Orlando, we know with the Wide World of Sports Disney connection down there, has the fields. They certainly have the facilities and the accommodations because of all the hotels that exist down there. The weather, it's been cold up north, but it'll be very, very hot. But that weather is not going to be a problem. I still see, though, a lot of hurdles of putting everybody in one place. And first and foremost, you have to get buy-in from the players. And is this a good idea to do it, or do you just completely shut it down and start anew, which would be next year, February or March of next year. I think that this is going to happen one way or another. But think of the logistics of it, the safety, which has to be paramount. Stuff like players that have babies or are pregnant, so potential babies coming along soon. Players that have medical problems, players that are international players that have families that have just moved to cities and are trying to function. All of these different things come into play. And just the actual cost, okay? We all know that Major League Soccer, from a business perspective, when it comes to the television broadcast deal that they have, that's not what's driving the league yet. Maybe someday it will, and certainly not to the extent that and the importance that other leagues have. So while you certainly want to satisfy business contracts and the broadcasting contracts out there and establish something for further contracts to be more, that you're not, it doesn't have to happen. But you also, there's an optics part of it, and wanting to at least do something in 2020 to put yourself on that sports map, because we know other leagues are going to find a way to come back, and bigger leagues that are going to take up a tremendous amount of bandwidth out there. But man, oh man, Mosse, I don't, if this happens, and I do think that it'll happen, I will love to hear how it all came about and all of the conversations and the work that was done logistically to make something like this happen.
No, I agree. I have a lot of questions. I have to learn more about this plan, but it seems like it's gaining a lot of momentum. I'm with you. I think this is the way they're going to end up going. And
it would be, a potential, maybe a World Cup type of scenario, and everybody plays a certain amount of games, and then there's an ultimate champion, and that champion would be a title winner, but I think it'll be a standalone type of event. So you won the 2020, give it whatever branded name you want, give a sponsor attached to it, and it won't be as if in the annals and in the history books that's a MLS title. It will just be a standalone type of title that everybody knows in 2020. This is what you want. Now, as we mentioned, it won't be in front of people, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to learn and they are not going to adjust with what they have seen. We already talked earlier about, I feel that the audio is huge. I think it can dramatically change the viewing experience. And so the piping in of audio, the virtual fans, so even the aesthetic that we see right now of the empty stands, covering that up in some way, shape, or form. And since they're not doing it in the big stadiums, they'll be doing it in much smaller type of areas. Maybe the potential for the green screenish type of thing to exist, maybe it's much more conducive to doing some of those things. I think all of that is on the table. And as I said, I'm sure MLS is thinking about ways to, if they do this thing in Orlando, make it as palatable and unique and different and special, especially not just comparing it to Bundesliga, but all the other leagues that are going to come on and all the other games that are going to come on. But once again, that costs money. That costs money. All right. Well, anyway, Mosse, we will see if any of that comes to fruition. Anything else there from Ask Alexi?
No, that is it.
All right. Well, listen, use that hashtag Ask Alexi out there and continue to send us your comments, questions, and concerns out there, and we'll read them as we go along. There were great ones this week, and so keep them coming. Mosse, we've come to the end, haven't we?
Yep.
Well, at the end of each show, as you know, I give you one for the road. And this is going back to, once again, the 1900s, way back in 1992. Yours truly was privileged to be a part of the 1992 Olympic team. For those that don't remember, that was the Olympics that happened, Summer Olympics that happened in Barcelona, Spain. At the time, from a soccer perspective, what people maybe don't remember is that it had been made to under 23 at the time of the Olympics. There were no overaged players. Now you're allowed 3. And I was with a group of players. We were all under 23 at the time of the Olympics, and it was a who's who of players that then matriculated onto the national team, myself and Kobe Jones and Brad Friedel and Mike Lapper and Chris Henderson and Kurt Anolfo and people that are all involved in soccer nowadays, Kurt Anolfo and Manny Lagos, and so many different players out there that were so important. Dante Washington, all of these great players that are still involved in the game one way or another. So we went over to Barcelona, and this comes as and it comes from another question that I got regarding the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, and a guy named Straight Outta HP had sent me something asking me if I ever got to meet or watch any of the USA basketball dream team, and if so, any good stories or memories. Now, keep in mind, this was the dream team that involved guys like Jordan. Who else was on that? David Robinson, I know, was there. You got anybody else out
Boy,
there?
that's the second name you jumped to, on the Admiral. Magic Johnson, Larry Bird.
Magic Johnson, that's right. I heard of him. So
no
yes.
Isaiah Thomas, though, which is a big point of
Don't get me started on Isaiah. Okay, don't get me started. It's a whole other podcast, my friend, and I don't want to get all riled up. I've been calm throughout the podcast today. So yeah, look, it was a who's who. It was this dream team. We were sending our absolute best. There was never even a question that they were going to win the gold. There was never a question. It was just by how much they were going to beat these teams. So we were in the Olympic Village in Barcelona. I say we, the soccer team. We were staying in the Olympic Village, and Olympic Village is an incredible experience for those that are lucky enough to be able to go through it. Because if you have all of these incredible athletes all pushed together and living and functioning as a society, but they're all highly achieving, very, very competitive, A-type personalities, all of that kind of stuff put into a confined space. Keep in mind that the dream team was not staying at the Olympic Village. As a matter of fact, they were staying at some incredible digs which was, the fact that they were incredible stars and they would be mobbed anywhere that they went, including the Olympic Village. So they were not staying in it. One of the things that, unlike in 96 when I played in the Olympics, 1992 we made a point of doing is going to the opening ceremonies. And it was important. It was important to us, and we were able to go. In 96, we weren't able to go. So we had our hats and our blazers and the uniform that all the Olympians were wearing. You amass outside the stadium, and then you walk in. The U.S. team is always one of the biggest teams. We field one of the biggest teams. And so I was surrounded by all of these incredible athletes. In the Olympic Village, I had seen people walk around like Boris Becker or, I don't know, Jim Curry or different people. And they would just be walking around, just hanging out. So in going into the stadium for the opening ceremonies, it was just the American team. And there was the dream team just sitting there. And look, you see the dream team, even if you're athletes, you're in awe. And you also know that the cameras are going to be on these people, all right? They're not going to be on anybody else. So a lot of people wanted to get close to the Magics and those types of players that were there. You walk into the stadium, and I immediately look up into the tribune as I'm walking along, waving our hats, and it's a surreal type of experience. And you look up and you see Nelson Mandela. You look up and you see Fidel Castro. You look up and you see all of these world dignitaries sitting there. And once again, in these moments, you don't have the soundtrack that you associate with monumental moments. So you don't have the gravitas of it. You're just actually living it. The same thing happens when you walk on the field of a World Cup. You don't have that soundtrack and that music that you normally associate with. And that is different, and that's jarring. My lasting memory of the Olympics in 92 and that opening ceremonies was, so yes, to your question, I did see the dream team, and we walked out into the stadium with the dream team. We didn't hang out or go to drinks or or anything like that, but they were part of the Olympic team, and we walked out. But I'll never forget, at one point there was a tarp, I think it was a flag, that was draped over the entire infield of the track stadium there. which went over the heads of all of the Olympians from all the different nations. And I'll never forget turning and seeing a young lady that was standing next to me wearing the United States uniform that we were all wearing. And she had no shoes on, and she was just dancing under this tarp. And it was Jennifer Capriati, for those that don't know, one of the phenoms, female tennis player phenoms of the, I guess it would be the early 90s and 90s and late 80s. And, she was very much a flower child-esque type of persona at that time. And she was just dancing alone to herself, twirling around with no shoes on underneath this canopy of tarp that was an Olympic flag or something like that. So it was a surreal experience from top to bottom. I was also in a cast at that time because I had broken my 5th metatarsal in the previous weeks, and we were in a race against time to get me back fit. And I ended up actually playing in the Olympics with a broken foot. I wore a size that was 2 sizes too big on my left foot as opposed to my right foot. And I actually wore a cast that was made for my foot that went into the Copa, the Adidas Copa that I was wearing. So those are some stories from that time, loosely associated with the Dream Team. But since I am watching The Last Dance, Mosse, I will have much more to say on members of the Dream Team, not the least of which is Michael Jordan. So I'm getting into that, as you know. So this time next week, I will have finished the Last Dance, and I'm actually watching it with my son. And my son he knows who Michael Jordan is, but he has no real concept of what Michael Jordan was. And he's actually really enjoying it. And I think seeing somebody that ultra competitive, it's interesting to see his reaction and how much he either appreciates and respects it, or in a certain way it turns him and maybe turns others off. I don't know. I don't know how he's going to be affected by that competitiveness that at times we all know went to a completely different place, which is what made him one of the greats. Mosse, anything before we go?
Yeah, one last thing on the sports documentary front. We received an Ask Alexi question a couple weeks ago about Formula One, comparing Ayrton Senna to Pele in Brazil. And that kind of motivated me to watch this Netflix documentary about Formula One racing. It's called Drive to Survive. And I'm loving it. I'm in the middle of season 2. And I think this is going to make me a Formula One fan when it comes back. I'm really, really enjoying it, learning about the drivers of different teams. And it's interesting to connect it to Bundesliga, how much Red Bull have sort of crashed that sport as well. And they sponsor one of the top teams that contends for the world title. So, really, really enjoying it. I highly recommend it. And like I said, when things are back to normal and Formula One is up and running again, I think I'm going to start watching it.
Well, I don't know if I highly recommend this, but I'll finish with this. We are all watching different things. I just finished a series, a limited series. So it was started and finished 10 episodes, I think, of something called Reckoning. And it is on Netflix. I will recommend it loosely in that it's not going to change your life. It's not the greatest thing ever. It also is very strange because evidently it was filmed in Australia, but it's based in the United States, in a fictitious city or town, if you will, in the United States, which is in and of itself is a little mind-blowing, that they made this entire place out to be American. There's American flags, there's American cars, there's American, not necessarily American actors, but American accents but it's way too long. And it's one of those where instead of saying, gosh, I hope this is not the last episode, you're saying, I really hope this is the last episode. But you get through it. And nowadays our level when it comes to what passes for entertainment, we're pretty forgiving. So check it out if you want, and let me know what you think. Let us know what you think about everything that we have talked about or haven't talked about. Use that hashtag Ask Alexi out there. We appreciate the fact that even though I know everybody's schedules has been thrown out of whack because of the lockdown and the pandemic here, we still appreciate the fact that you are finding time to include us in your lives. Please continue to rate and subscribe and download and review and do all the things that you do out there on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube, whether you're watching, whether you're listening. Thank you so much for doing that. We certainly don't take it for granted, and we know, especially in this time, even more so in this time, how important and how grateful we are for people that do that. Mosse, anything before we go?
That's it.
All right, we will talk again next week. I hope you're staying safe, and as I said, I hope you're staying sane, and this too shall pass. All right, size the day.
You like that clip? Well, my State of the Union podcast drops every week. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.